All right. Hey, Wake. Well, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, everyone got to see that first episode of Digging Through History. Let's make it a better one this time around. Again, we're your hosts, Anthony
and Jim,
and let's kind of take it into let's say a different perspective now.
Well, we're gonna bring our last time we looked at old world slavery, as it's called.
Mm-hmm.
The slavery that has existed in history since there's history. Hammurabi mentions it, the Bible mentions it. It's been around for a long time. But it was always centered on the other, or those who, I guess you would say behaviorally based, although prisoners of war don't really consider themselves behaviorally based, but debtors, criminals, things like that. Slavery that's where it went. It wasn't generational, it wasn't racial in any real fashion other than, like we talked about, the others.
Yeah, again, this is we just talked about this before we started. This is going to be the transition period.
Yes, we're moving from an old system that is really universal with some short-lived and geographically small exceptions.
Right. And especially here, like what we mentioned last time here in the subcontinent of India.
We have a map.
Yay! The subcontinent of India, where we again have that caste system
right.
we talked about, and the idea that if you were born in a certain caste, then that's what you are, and that's what you will be for pretty much the rest of eternity.
Well, yeah. Well, until you're reincarnated into
right.
an upper caste.
Oh yes, I forgot about that.
It's probably the most institutionalized social system. I mean, just such a rigid system, with, of course, the bottom being the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We don't see anything, even in the American South, we talk about being a rigid, racially based, segregated social system. Really, you only have two. You have blacks and everybody else.
Right, exactly.
There's no in-between groups. There's no, I guess in whites you'd have your plantation owners versus small farmers, but it's not quite the same, because small farmers could become plantation owners and vice versa.
Right. So there's some mobility in that.
Right. So we see this system, and we see on the map up here, way up there at the top of Africa. I'm pointing at my laptop like you can see it. Up here, that slave trade doesn't stop. It still keeps going. It's been that way. What's our date here?
1700 to 1900. Well, I would even just go as present day.
There's not, from everything I've read on the nice new PC term, human trafficking sites, not the sites that do it, but the sites that are combating it.
Right.
They talk about the fact that the slave trade hasn't really changed a whole lot, and the slaves are used, I guess, for less direct economic exploitation. They're not planting cotton or things like that. Most of them are used as household servants, status symbols. In a vast majority of Arab countries and North African countries, slavery is illegal, but I know, in reading, without getting into a lot of detail about it, there's several countries that actively support it, even though they made it illegal so they could be part of the UN.
Which, okay, that's a story for another day.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue that we can talk about later. But we see that slave trade kept going. The new one that comes, starting with the Spanish and the Portuguese, is this slavery based in Africa. And at the beginning, this slavery has the same foundations as old world slavery. It's based on economics and other.
Right.
We need this for our economic well-being or our economic fortune, and we're going to only do it to people we consider other. And it's hard. People don't like to talk about it, but when you look, especially when you be talking 1500s, 1600s, where you don't have a lot of indoor living, you don't have air conditioning, things like that, the difference between black and white would be fairly extensive. I'm sure there'll be plenty of tanned Portuguese sailors.
Of course.
But there'd be startling differences between the two, so it'd be very easy to see other. And I mention that because that's going to become incredibly important in the next century, the 1600s instead of the 1500s.
Right, because again, in the 1500s, we see again these Portuguese sailors coming down, and they're coming across and trying to just kind of sail along this edge of the African coast, as you'll see on the map where I put onto the map there. They're not really focused on anything more than what, getting from Europe to Asia.
To the spices.
Right, they want to get into that spice trade that, of course, those Arab traders
Dominate.
are making money hand over fist.
Yes.
And that's the whole point of this this sailing across this vast ocean where most sailors had no idea what the heck was going on, 20 miles outside of their coast?
Well, yeah, or they knew point A to point B and
Right.
maybe point C, because that's what most sailors did. These guys who just pick up and take off and head around the bulge of Africa there, that's a huge deal that we have a hard time comprehending because we're looking at the map
Right.
that we've had forever. You know, it's been in our classrooms and our globes for as long as we've been alive. But these people didn't have these maps. They didn't have this understanding that, well, you know, when I go below the bulge of Africa, what happens? I don't know.
See, like again, they had no idea of this.
Yeah, that's just no.
That's a no zone because they never knew anything about that.
Yeah.
And really, ultimately, up until almost 1500,
Well, yeah, Henry the Navigator and that gang.
and Vasco da Gama, you really don't see much of anything outside of this section right here.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing that we kind of have to keep in mind when it comes to talking about this slave trade. You know, again, like we mentioned, this was an early time where it was, all right, we're going to take people, again, from this section of North Africa, or maybe even this section here of Senegal and what is now the Ivory Coast, and we're going to bring them up here to Europe. We're going to bring them into Central Europe for purposes of economics.
Right, which is already dying out.
Right.
It gets reborn with the, I guess economically speaking, you'd say the corporation. Larger bodies, larger economic units. The small farmer really doesn't have a lot of benefit from having a slave.
No.
It's another mouth to feed
Right.
during hard times. It's another person to have a room for. It's somebody else you have to watch out for because, well, they're slaves. They might want to run away or something.
Right. Well,
And
I would too.
I would too. It's a substantial investment of money for not a whole lot of return. When you can just go to town and hire day workers to finish your harvest or your planting or a special project or things like that. When you start seeing these larger economic units, which really show up in the New World with the Spanish and the Portuguese as they establish the first, now I can't, just drew a blank on the word, starts with an E.
Oh.
It's like the Spanish version of a plantation.
Yes.
Something or other. Hate when
I
that
know what
happens.
you mean. I can't remember it myself, but we'll get back onto that.
But anyway, that's what the Spanish and the Portuguese start establishing in the New World, and that requires labor.
of course, yes.
And one of the big failures of moving to the New World is natives don't make good slaves.
Oh my gosh.
They don't have a system in place. They don't have, other than the Aztecs to a certain extent, and maybe the Incas to a little bit as well, they don't have the social structure. Their social structures are much more egalitarian. Each man is seen as a warrior. Each woman is seen as a wife and a mother or a grandmother.
Right.
They have a place in the tribe. They don't have the city-based societies, except again, the Incas, Aztecs, for the most part. So when they're put into slavery, they literally just die. Some of them literally will just sit until they starve and die, which is wildly frustrating to these Portuguese and Spanish conquistadors and followers who want this. They want this big plot of land. They want to be barons and counts and dukes of like the old world where they have these serfs, slaves, doing their work for them so they can become incredibly wealthy because Brazil, not known for its riches in gold.
No.
Not everybody can be a Pizarro or
Right.
where he finds a ton of gold.
Right, and so the area that we're mostly focused on with that, especially with your conquistadors and the three Gs, gold, glory, and God.
Oh, gotta have
Of course,
those.
gotta have those. We're talking specifically here in the Mexican Peninsula area, even into Spanish Caribbean, Florida, Ponce de Leon, Hernan Cortez. Down here, where the Portuguese really are going to be focused on, they're really the ones. They're the ones that start this whole thing off.
Right.
They kick it off in the early 1500s, and well,
They're the beta testers.
yes,
They're
for
the
sure.
ones that show we can take Africans and
Mhm.
transplant them to this new world, and they will work for us for cheap, and we can make a ton of money.
Right.
So again, foundation is economically based, and
Right.
of course, who are you going to choose for your slaves? Somebody who is other.
Right.
And,
And
the Native Americans are other, but
they're an
they,
exception too.
well, they have two problems with their otherness. One, they start dying in mass
Oh, for
numbers
sure.
from smallpox and mumps and
Mhm,
measles
mhm.
and all these diseases that the conquistadors unwittingly bring, because of course nobody on any of these ships had any clue about germ theory.
Yeah, well,
The closest they came is throwing disease carcasses into cities. They knew that was bad,
yeah.
but they weren't disease carcasses, they were people, and they
Yeah.
came ashore.
And they were just they had that virus in their body, and then they
Yeah.
spread it.
All it took is one person whose body hadn't killed the virus, and all of a sudden, these Native Americans who have absolutely no resistance at all to these diseases start dying, and it spreads through the Americas so rapidly. It makes, really, as far as a population decrease, the numbers I see make the Black Death look kind of like a hiccup.
Mhm.
And we'll see it later when we talk about settlement in North America, especially where these people come and they land on these shores and there's just nobody there.
Right.
Which 100 years prior, there would have been a tribe, or one of the tribes that is in the area would have had expanded territory into where they landed. But because of this onslaught of disease, the scourge, really, for a lack of a better term, just wipes out so many native populations, including entire tribes at times.
Mhm.
Because at a certain point, population-wise, if you drop below a certain number, you become unsustainable genetically.
Right.
So whereas you might have had a tribe, say, living in Louisiana,
Mhm.
who was doing okay, but then the mumps run through, and suddenly the people who aren't dead are sterile, a generation or two later, they're gone. They're
Right.
either absorbed by the tribes around them, or they become extinct as a
Right.
group. I don't think Albert Schweitzer could have landed in 1500 and saved the Native Americans.
Unfortunately
it's an
not.
unfortunate fact. And then, of course, the second part, you have a lack of natives suddenly.
Right.
And then secondly, you have this social thing that natives do not function well in a slave setting. I'm not saying every native sat down and died, but enough of them did that it just became very, very difficult to get the work. There was a whole lot more effort that these, conquerors didn't want to put in.
Well, and you also have to think about it this way too. If you are taking people, say you're taking people, natives, from here in North America or in South America, and you are saying, work this land, well, that's their land that they know.
Yes.
They're going to run away.
Well, they're going to run away. Well, and for the vast majority, especially in North America, but in South America to a large extent, they're hunter-gatherers.
Right.
They don't know about anything beyond slash and burn agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
which is not what the Spanish and the Portuguese are going to be asking for. And then, of course, the Dutch and the English and the French are looking for a much more European traditional agricultural. So that it's just, you're trying to put a square peg into a round hole.
Right.
And you're using a hammer to make it happen.
Exactly.
So it doesn't work well. But Africans had been, really, if you look at the world in 1400, or 1300, Europe, Africa, Asia, they're all about the same level of technology. It's just that switch that Europe had that just suddenly flipped on, starting about the time of the Black Death, that suddenly makes their technology level so much higher, which allows this conquest, imperialism, colonialism, all these things that come out of it, because they could just show up in an area and one or two, or well, we see with Cortez. I mean, he didn't land with that many men, and he conquers an empire that had hundreds of thousands of troops. So anyway, the focus changes to these Africans because their social systems and their understanding, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, how they got on board those ships, has a huge bearing. The concept of prisoners of war being used as slaves is not unusual to Africans.
Right.
So they already have a mental understanding of what's going on, which allows them to adapt to being a slave. I can't imagine a good thing. I can't imagine it's not dehumanizing in so many ways, but they had the mental, I don't know, flexibility, I guess, because most people will try to survive regardless of the circumstances. Survival is more important than a protest against slavery, when the vast majority of these protests would have
failed.
Well, they would have gone nowhere.
Yeah.
You know, the best you could have done is caused a slave uprising, which occurred periodically.
Sure.
But usually was met, especially with the Portuguese, with incredible viciousness, which would, you know, okay, so you revolted on your plantation and now everybody's dead.
Yep.
And they just go buy some new people. And that's one of the horrid things we see about slavery, period. I mean, old world or new world, that's
right.
the thing. If your owner or whatever decided they were done with you, they could kill you. And it really didn't matter to anybody.
No, because you were
And
not,
they just go get new ones.
and that's the thing, that many of these people weren't that. They were not people.
Yeah, that's right. They weren't seen as people.
And again, that's where the theme of this, the transition, where we're moving away from that old world slavery where people, again, prisoners of war, debtors, whoever it may be, they were considered still people. They were working, they may have had a debt to pay off, or they may have had something wrong, but again, still considered people.
Well, their children were to be considered people, maybe not citizens, because that was that concept would come really later.
Right.
But they weren't considered. Their children wouldn't be considered property.
Right.
Their marriage would be considered important. Although I'm sure there were plenty of abuses in the old world too. But once again, when we talk about these big strokes of history, slavery covering, well, now we're going to be covering 7,000 years of human history, we have to look at the majority of situations. Old world slavery, typically, I don't say that they value the individual, but they recognize that just because Bob is a slave doesn't mean that his children are slaves. It doesn't mean that Bob and Mary can't be a couple, because that's considered norm.
Right.
Everybody does that, so why wouldn't slaves?
Yeah.
Now we see the New World slavery coming in. It gets twisted rather rapidly.
And you're right. And the thing that we're going to see here in just a second is again how twisted it can be.
Oh yeah.
And the way in which they would try to get these slaves. And I mean, again, we talk in the beginning, early 1500s, we see the Portuguese coming down along the coastal area of West Africa. And I mean, honestly, if you're a tribes person on the coastal waters here in Senegal, you're gonna think these people, have massive ships.
Oh.
Huge white sails.
Many times the size of anything we have.
Right. And so when they're coming along these areas here, and they're coming into these contact of these people, they're thinking, whoa, first off, I gotta protect myself. And so that's where you quickly see a large number of these coastal tribes. They're ultimately bargaining.
Well, I mean, same for the Portuguese and the Spanish.
Right.
They're trying to make money. They have to pay for the food they eat when they're on their ship. They have to pay salaries. They have to pay their investors something back. So they're going to look for a way to make money. And in West Africa, there's ivory,
Yes.
but it's a fairly limited supply, difficult to get even for the people who live there.
Right.
And of course, Europeans through this entire time until the very end of this time frame that we're talking of, cannot venture very far into the continent of Africa. The diseases there due to Europeans, what the European diseases did to the Native Americans.
Right.
Yellow fever, sleeping sickness,
Mm-hmm.
well, just malaria. Even though malaria was in Europe, it wasn't very prevalent outside of, I know it was in Rome even, because they had swamps.
Right.
But for the most part, Europeans had moved to the point where they drained swamps that had malarial carrying mosquitoes. They could make that connection. If we got rid of that swamp, we don't have malaria, life is better.
Right.
In Africa, that's not even doable. You'd have to drain an entire center of a continent. It's just not, it's not an option.
It just doesn't work.
It's not an option at all.
Right.
But these people need to make money.
Yes.
That's their goal.
Right.
So they look at these tribes that they're talking to. I'm not obviously the other would be present, but I don't know that it had become a up-down other yet.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, obviously the Portuguese that made it around were dealing with Asians, Indonesians,
Yes.
and they were others as well, but we don't see the slave trade form there because there wasn't an up-down situation yet.
Mhm.
They saw them as equals. Somebody to buy spices from, they're gonna make a ton of money when they bring these spices back. So
Right.
everybody's happy.
Right.
This, they're looking at, there's some gold in West Africa,
Mhm.
but again, it's hard to get a lot of gold without modern mining techniques.
Sure.
So you're left with, what do they have a surplus of? People.
Yes.
Captured from their own wars.
Right. And most of the time, it's coming here from the central portion of Africa, where many of your African groups will come into the interior of the continent, and then they will turn around and bring them to the coasts. And one very important aspect of this, and the Portuguese are very well known for this, and as well as the Spanish, and it's the factories. And those factories, not like what we think of as factories, like, you know, a box factory or a car manufacturing factory or whatever the case, these are holding cells for people. And those are just, it is atrocious of some of the things they would be having to deal with. And, you know, of course, disease is a major problem for anyone who's along the coast.
Yeah. Well, yeah, any European for sure.
And again, you have new people coming into areas they've never heard of before, never seen before, and it causes a problem. Because again, you don't know where you're at, you don't know what these people are doing, you don't know how they're going to be treating you, and so you have that fear factor that ultimately brings them into this idea of fight or flight. And most of the time it's I'm gonna fight you.
Yes.
Because they are angry by being taken away from their home, from their native areas, and put onto a building that says, okay, this is where you will be for the rest of your day. And if you even make it onto the ship, then, oh, well, that's just another hurdle.
Well, that adaptability,
Mhm.
they understand, yes, they've been captured in a war with Ghana, and they've been taken there as a slave. Well, that's what they do when they capture Ghanese. So that's well within their mental framework. But now there's these people who don't, they're others.
Yes.
Again, the others thing pops up. These are strangers in a way that the people who captured them are not.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're kept in these cells, sometimes for months, waiting for the next ship to make it because, well, these ships aren't reliable. They don't run on time.
No, they're not a
They're
train.
at the mercy of the winds
Mhm.
and waves.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, they get on these ships in chains, which is never going to be comfortable.
No.
And for the most part, even before we talk about the tight packing situations of later times,
Right.
you're still in ultimately squalid conditions where you're all underneath the decks and you're down near the equator.
Right.
Safety violation, I'm sure. You're down here at the equator, it's hot all the time.
Of course.
And so you're stuck under the decks. You're not getting good airflow.
No.
You're sitting in your own filth
Of course.
because nobody cares. I know I've read a couple examples of some of the more successful, which is a horrible way to put it, but it's true. From the aspect of a slave trader, more successful means he makes more money.
Right.
That they would bring them up on decks in groups of 4 or 5. They would get fresh air every day. They would basically throw buckets of water down to help wash the filth off and out. And they would have a much better return on investment. But most of these slave traders, not that interested. They're just put a bunch of bodies in. Basically the difference between a retailer and a wholesaler.
Right.
The retail slave traders treated their slaves fairly well. They're still slaves. They don't deal with rebellion except with violence. They're still awful, but compared to the ones that cram them in there, don't care for them, and they're just happy that 2/3 of them made it to, Bahia or Amazonia. That's all they care about. And then they sell them off as quickly as possible. The people that buy them have to nurse them back to health, even make them useful.
And going along with that, I had read some information myself that when a person died, if you were chained to a partner, which usually they did 2 by 2, when you had a person next to you die, you had to stay with that person almost the whole trip.
Well, yeah, if they died early, you were probably stuck with them unless you were dealing with one of these guys who actually would unchain them and...
Right, a more, how could I put it, more of a reasonable, civilized style of slave trader, which again, that's a few and far between.
Exactly. We are not talking about the kindest and gentlest that are going into this business. The kindest and gentlest are the people where we see the tension that happens almost immediately when we see this slave trade growing from Africa. Of course, we have this otherness, but on the other side of that coin, we have a large number of members of the church who are seeing them as human.
Yes.
Which I'm sure the slave traders didn't appreciate.
No.
They saw them as humans who did not know Jesus, and so therefore, these are people we should preach the gospel to. That was the goal. And we start seeing this conflict early on in Spanish settlement. I don't know so much about the Portuguese, I don't know their history as well. But the Spanish colonialism, there was this tension almost immediately between parts of the church, not all the church for sure, but parts of the church and the settlers, for lack of a term. They don't have settlers like we think of settlers with our wagons cutting down trees and having a thing. Conquerors really probably the best. Occupiers, maybe even a better word. We see this tension between them almost immediately. That one group sees them as people who should be redeemed and treated well, even if they're still slaves. I don't know that there was a huge amount of movement in the church to free them.
No.
I don't remember reading much about that.
That will mostly come later in the British style, and they still don't even free them. They still don't technically free these black individuals who are coming into the North American colonies. I mean, what they may do is they will say, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but what they'll do is they'll say, okay, no Christian could be a slave. And so when they come onto North American soil, they'll baptize them and they'll convert them to Christianity. But they're not considered slaves, so they're more of an indentured servant.
Right. What was the phrase? Perpetually indentured servant?
Yeah, pretty much.
Perpetually
indentured.
Lifetime indentured servant, which other than a lot more letters, it's nothing different than slave.
Exactly. Even talking about indentured servants coming from Europe into the North American colonies, that's still pretty much slavery, because the things that they were given were, well, long far from where they were. You know, they were getting terrible living conditions. They were still having to work the fields, and they may or may not have gotten the land that they were promised.
Right. Well, or they work for the 7 years, but then they owe debt to their
sponsor.
I guess maybe be a better word, because master would be a stronger word that I don't know that would apply, since we're the topic we're dealing with.
Right.
But still, yeah, you had indentured servants that would be indentured for 10, 15 years when they were supposed to be 7. But getting back to because we're moving into the North American.
Right.
We're not there yet, but we can see from the big trunk. He can do it better. I don't have access to the cool pin. He can do the John Madden thing. Pow! But the big trunk, you see the slaves go south of what becomes the United States. I mean, that's 3, almost 4 million, 5 million, another, of the entire slave trade. I don't remember what the final numbers are, but the numbers that come into America are much smaller in comparison. Which is why when you think of the Dominican Republic, Haiti,
Mm-hmm.
these are almost purely black. The natives mostly died or were killed.
Right.
So these islands were basically there for the taking. Of course, these conquistador kind of mindset people want to have their big plantation. They want to get rich in the new world. They need slaves.
Exactly.
And so they just import tons of them over and over again. And I guess to keep on the indentured servant thing for just a bit, when we look at this area, southeast Brazil all the way up to Virginia, malaria is a huge issue. Huge issue. And Africans are not immune to malaria. You can look it up online. There's people still talking about bringing back DDT to try to save the number of people who die in Africa every year from malaria. That's today even. But when we look at this, you bring over an indentured servant, half of them were keeling over from some disease. Even in Virginia, which is what we consider a fairly temperate climate.
Right.
The Caribbean, just no. It
You
wasn't
were-
working. It wasn't going to work.
Yeah, you were getting slaughtered. Well, not slaughtered, but you were dying in exceptional numbers. And especially when you think about this, when you're looking at places here in this southern hemisphere, for instance, like the southeastern Brazil or even the Amazonia area, this is not your typical lifestyle.
Well, it's not a European climate for
No,
sure.
for sure. I mean, because if you're coming from Europe, you're looking at more of a temperate, almost even a continental would be a good one, especially if you're coming from Central Europe. But I mean, even people here in Africa, they're not used to these styles of climates in a way, because again, the trade winds, the currents, you're seeing a whole different aspect of life, of climate in those sections of the world. And coming into Brazil where you're literally forced to work for your master until you die.
Which unfortunately for most Europeans that would come would be very, very short. And again, once again, coming back to that bedrock foundation of slavery, it's about economics.
Mhm.
It costs a lot of money to recruit people from, say, Ireland,
Yeah.
and then ship them all the way down to, say, Antigua,
Yeah, no.
a British colony, and then they die within a year. You're not getting that 7 years worth of work, even if you were a perfectly honest sponsor,
Yes.
for lack of a better term. You're not getting your money back.
No.
So you're going to have to turn to the only group of people that you can find that don't seem to have as much of a problem with malaria, and that would be West Africans.
Yes.
Because the sickle cell trait, horribly deadly in some cases when it flares up badly, but it does confer not immunity, it's not
Don't
immunity,
confuse
a
the two.
resistance
Right.
to malaria. It's kind of like something being fireproof as opposed to flame retardant.
Right. Exactly.
Once it gets too hot, the flame retardant stuff burns.
Right.
The fireproof, like you're safe, hopefully doesn't burn until, well, it doesn't.
Right. Again, when we talk about the idea of an indentured servant, these are mostly whites.
Mostly, yes.
Yes. And again, as you can see from just our complexion, we would not last very long in
Brazil?
Right. No.
I went to Panama once, thanks. That was, whoa, hot.
I mean, just the idea, again, of course, the melatonin in the skin, the amount of resistance, if you will, not only to the malaria aspect, but even just the heat and the sun beating down on you, there's no wonder these Europeans were focused heavily on Central and West African.
Yes. Well, because yes, if you go farther south, they're more desert people.
Exactly.
They don't necessarily have the trait as
Right.
much. What East Africans, of course, would still be dominated by
Arabs.
the Arabs at this time. So you didn't go over there to get slaves because
No.
you might end up a slave.
Right. And so again, what you find, Africa is it's a conglomeration of climates in itself.
What's a continent?
It is. And so of course you've got in the southern portion, you've got wetland areas, parts of it being a coastal region in today South Africa. But when you get into just above South Africa, you're starting to see almost a steppe climate, which again is grasslands, low-lying areas, and then you get into more of your rainforests around the equator. Rainforests in Africa, I mean, most people associate Africa with what?
Jungle.
Jungle. Sahara up in the north, you didn't really care so much about that. But this here, the jewel of Africa, along the coastal lines here of the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, and then here into the Congo River, Central Africa is where it's at.
Well, notice the names: Gold Coast, Ivory Coast.
Right.
This is where Europeans saw a chance to make money, which is the foundation of the triangle trade, which becomes so important in American history.
Yes.
People bringing bringing finished goods,
Mm-hmm.
guns, a lot of it, because
Mhm.
what allows people to conquer better than guns?
Right.
Then they trade those guns for slaves who take them to the Caribbean, who make rum, and then they trade rum for guns.
Yep.
It's a nice little circle. I don't know that there were any ships that did all three legs of the triangle. I think most of them concentrated on one
Yes.
leg.
Yes.
But I'm sure there were some independent Yankee traders
Of course.
from Connecticut, especially. Those were famous. I mean, they were famous for their shipping industry.
Mhm.
That might have run the whole thing. I mean, why not? You get all the profit from every leg of the journey.
You're making yourself a big chunk of change.
But so, as we move into the 1600s, well, we start seeing North America become settled.
Yes.
1607 with Jamestown, 1620 with the Plymouth colony,
Mhm.
and then a rapid slew of the mid-Atlantic colonies, and then
Right.
petering out into the 1700s with Georgia and
Mhm.
the southern parts. Of course, the Spanish are already there in Florida and Texas, and it's one of those weird things that America was actually settled, if you look at the early settlements from Europeans, west to east. Because the Spanish came up through Mexico,
Right. Yeah.
California, the Gulf Coast. That was all Spanish for a long time.
So again, like Hernan Cortez,
Ponce de Leon.
Ponce de Leon, you've got even
Coronado.
Right, and they're coming in from these areas here, and in a way, they are like Jim just mentioned. They're coming in this way, and they're settling here in Spanish Florida. They're settling here in the Caribbean, and it's not really until the 1600s that we do see most of the. Let me change my color here real quick, and that's
Maybe
what I
not.
wanted. There we go.
There you go.
Change my color. And we see here that in this region is where you're finding the British.
Right. The French went to the interior.
Right.
The
And
little
so,
ruins.
yep. So the French are here. Well, that's kind of glittery, but oh well. They like the glitter anyway.
Yeah.
So you've got your French here in the middle section, right there along the rivers.
Yes,
Of
because
course.
the French take a completely different, outside of the Caribbean, the French take a different aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Here in St. Joe, we have Joseph Robidoux, who was
Mhm.
famous for being a cruel slave owner. But he was a fur trapper. They didn't settle in the
No.
way we understand. They had small villages and stuff, and even St. Louis was very small.
Right.
But in the Caribbean, they have the same pattern of settlement as the British, the Dutch, the Spanish. Big plantations,
Mhm.
small numbers of white Europeans with large numbers of slaves,
Right.
almost exclusively African slaves at this point.
Exactly.
Because the natives didn't work out because they died too quickly of disease. The Europeans didn't work out because they died too quickly of disease.
Yeah. And that's the thing we got to remember about the British. They were the fourth really major group of dealing with the slaves.
Yeah,
Because
really.
you've got what, Portuguese and Spanish coming in first.
Yep.
And then you've got the Dutch, and then the French, and then finally the British. And the British will dominate by about the middle of the 16th century or 1600s into the ultimately the 17 and 1800s.
Definitely the 1700s it becomes, well, that's when they become British as opposed
Right.
to English.
Right.
It's also where they become, the Britannia rules the waves.
Yes.
Once they start dominating the trade because they beat the Dutch, I think it's 3 successive Anglo-Dutch wars, which are fought really over trade more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
The English did a very nice job of forcing the French to only do stuff in North America. And then, of course, a couple little islands where you grow sugar doesn't threaten anybody's
Right.
economy, so there's no reason to push them off Martinique,
Or Guadalupe.
or
yeah, any of those others.
Haiti even.
Right. Well, and they've got their own problem with Haiti that we're going to talk about later. But
Yeah, that'll be a couple episodes from now.
Yes.
We'll talk about Haiti. But we see this development that the reliance economically comes to be on black slaves. Why? Economics first, because they're cheap, because they can sell them guns that they bought wholesale, get
Mhm.
people, trade them for rum, the whole triangle trade.
Right.
Then of course, the hardiness, I guess, for lack of a better term, of the black slaves, the ability to resist malaria on a larger scale than Europeans could. And here you go. You have this sudden flip. The old world system where it's prisoners of war, which a large number of these black Africans are prisoners of war,
Yes.
but they're secondhand
Right.
prisoners of war. You didn't take them. You're not like a Roman going out and conquering the Germanic tribes and taking
Right.
slaves.
Right.
You bought them from somebody who did conquer them,
Right.
or just raided for them, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see these population shifts as the European mindset changes from an idea that I go to the New World to make money and then I go home,
Yeah. No.
to I go to the New World and I stay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then they look around and they realize, well, we've got to do something. This doesn't seem safe. How do we tell who's free and slave? Because especially, again, in the North American colonies, we have this tension going on, not just about treating them as other, but many slave owners treated them as indentured servant. After 7 years, they'd be set free.
Mhm.
Well, suddenly you have a bunch of free blacks
Yeah.
in, say, South Carolina, which is a scary thing for the people of the whites of South Carolina, because at one point it's 60% black.
You're now
White.
white.
You're outnumbered.
You're
And
outnumbered.
and you go to the Caribbean, it's even worse.
Mhm.
We're talking 80 to 90% black,
Mhm.
probably closer to 90 in most cases, because it's just this sprinkling. It's literally salt.
Yes.
On
Exactly.
top of the melange of people that
Mhm.
are working the plantations,
Mhm.
and they realize that slaves resent being whipped, starved, having their marriages taken apart,
Yes.
and people sold. Just generally, they don't like being treated less than human for some odd reason. I can't
wonder
imagine.
why.
And of course, then you got all the religious tension that hangs on in America just like it does in the South.
Right.
You have these people that go out and they see these people, not as other, but as fellow humans. And maybe not in the way we would, as 21st century Americans, would want them to talk about them or treat them. But it's such a change from the slave owners and the slave ship captains and all these other people that are treating them not just as other, but as lesser.
Right.
And this is where we start seeing what today would be called white supremacy. We start making laws that slavery is now based on race. And that happens in Virginia and...
Yeah, it happened mostly in Virginia and in South Carolina.
Mhm.
And one of the first of these major racial laws came about when you start to see the difference in punishment, and the fact that there was a case which I had read, and I actually teach about it in my Black History class, that there were a group of 3 men, 2 indentured servants from, I believe they were Scots, Irish possibly, and a black man. So the 2 white indentured servants were given a longer indentured servitude. They had, 3 or 4 more years added to their contract. The white man, or the black man, unfortunately, he was given a lifetime placement with his master. And so by about 1640, 1650, you start to see a transition. And going back to that buzzword again that we talked about at the beginning, a transition from this seeing them as others to now being lesser than thou. And that's where we're starting to have a major problem, where even it becomes now you will have your offspring be still now considered
because
that.
Because the color of their skin. Rather than, and of course they start what were the laws were called? Basically absolutely banning racial mixing.
Oh yes.
Well, at least from black male to white female.
Oh, yes. Nothing like that was
all we had to do was talk about Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
It didn't work the other way.
Right.
But there was, that was a huge thing. It was a massive penalty for a white woman.
Oh yes.
To be caught with a black man. And I'm sure in a whole lot of circumstances that the cry of rape came out later. Because the penalties for her were pretty astronomical. Jail time, deportation.
She could have even become a slave herself.
Yes.
Because the fact of her intermingling
I guess
with a black man.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, women were still considered other in a sense of social status.
Yes, they were. Their job was to make babies and take care of the household.
Right.
Of course, in the Americas, very often oversee the household, which, was a different. We always see slave masters as cruel and vicious men, but household slaves were very often run by the mistress of the house, whoever that may be. And of course, that changes. We'll talk more about the difference between North and South when we get talking about America more, but it is, we see that transition.
Yep.
And that's really the thrust of today's talk, is that we see this transition from that old world slavery that economically based, new world still economically based.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing angers people than threatening their wallet.
Oh no.
That's a buzzword. That's a phrase for American politics.
Right.
People always vote their economic self-interest. That's just a truism. And when we talk about slave owners especially when we start talking 3rd and 4th generation slave owners, we have to resist. Even though we talk about these big overarching patterns of people, movement, and activity, we have to resist deeply the concept that there is some sort of monolithic slave group that all of Europeans got together and said, well, they're bad, they're black, we're going to take them.
Yeah.
We have to really resist that, because like we talked about, there's a tension in the Spanish church, how to treat natives and how to treat Africans. Same thing we see in the North as well. And those bear fruit hundreds of years later, but it's there from the very beginning.
Right.
And so we have to resist very much the idea that everything is this monolithic. Yes, but people swim in the water that they are born into. Very few people in history, and those are the ones we should celebrate, these people that break the mold or change the paradigm that we live in. Sometimes they don't even do it in their own lifetime. I think the best example for me would be Thomas Jefferson. He saw a vision of a world where all men are created equal. He probably didn't really have an idea how much that would change the concepts of how we live today. But it changed. The promise of that led to the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. Everything comes out of that writing of a guy who was a slave owner.
Right. And it just, again, it brings it back to the idea that he did it for economic reasons.
Yes.
In some cases, he may have treated his slaves as they were lesser.
Well, by keeping them as slaves, it pretty much defines lesser by this point in history.
Right. But again, it's more along the lines of he needed to make money.
And he wasn't very good at that.
No, he wasn't.
He
No, he
wasn't very
wasn't, because
good.
he was flat broke by the time he died.
Well, he was flat broke several times before he died.
Yep.
too. Well, in fact, that's one of the reasons he didn't free his slaves earlier, because it cost money to manumit your slaves.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. It was a significant amount of money.
Yes.
$50 or $100, depending on the state, I'm sure.
In
And that's a lot of money when you
Yes.
start talking hundreds of
Mhm.
slaves, and
Mhm.
you start talking 1770s dollars.
right. That's a huge chunk of your income wasted.
But by the time we reach 1807, which was what we talked about as kind of the stopping point, this is where the United States bans the importation of slaves
Right.
after 1807.
Right.
England hasn't done it yet.
They're
They're getting close.
They're getting very close.
Wilberforce and his group are really pushing at this point, but
Mhm.
they're distracted. In 1807, they're fighting a war with Napoleon.
Right.
No matter where you are, no matter where you are in American history, world history, a war always, at one time, slows social change, while at the same time pushing social change.
Mhm.
It's a really interesting, during the war, nothing typically changes.
Right.
It's very rare. I mean, we see that with blacks in America with the Second World War,
Mhm.
and things like that. Nothing would change during the war, but after the war, people start changing things because they see something differently. Wars shift paradigms probably faster than anything else.
Well, you kind of have to say there's a major social change because you're having a group of people go off to war, leaving the lesser person
Right. Yeah.
to keep the home fires burning, really.
Yes.
So I mean, in a way,
It's
it's an idea of how the women's rights movement came in
Yes.
the post World War I era. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it came to fruition in the post World War I era.
Yeah, it was
But-
already building after the Civil War. Well, really after the Revolution.
Right, but because of that war, women were working in the factories and they were helping to keep the home together, and that's really what defined that peace that ended everything.
Yeah. And so, kind of to wrap that up, the transition has occurred between 1550
Mm-hmm.
and 1700. The transition is almost complete.
Yes.
You don't really see Europeans enslaved,
No.
especially in the New World.
No.
You would in Arabic Africa, because those depredations keep occurring.
Yes.
I want to say probably until the late 1700s. Probably the Barbary Coast,
Yes.
because that's
Mhm.
Thomas Jefferson. That's 1803.
Yeah.
So
And I mean, really, you see a large amount of problems along the North African Mediterranean coast with the British.
Mhm.
And the Suez Crisis and problems with the French and that
that's the 1800s.
and that I mean there's still problems that are even into that time period. So
But the economic basis of slavery is still there and still very strong, even though we see in a lot of our founding fathers' documents, they talk about the idea that it is withering on the vine.
right.
It's just not as efficient as, and we really see that in the Americas, because it's the first place we see independent farmers truly able to reach the economy of scale of larger farms in Europe.
Right.
But Europe is, of course, entangled in its own mesh of nobility and rights, baronial rights and things like that. It's going to take a couple revolutions for that to be kind of kicked out. In America, we see, New England and Pennsylvania farmers growing wealthy enough to become senators and things on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And their productivity is so much greater using hired help than we see in the South with slave help.
Right.
But what motivation does a slave have? They do enough work to avoid the whip.
Yep.
And that's true throughout history. But in the North, when you're working for a paycheck and maybe even the promise of a harvest bonus, if say you live in Philadelphia and you're going out to the countryside to work for harvest, you're going to work a lot harder
Well,
because it's a direct reward. you get something out of it.
And what's the main understanding that we've talked about over the last 2 episodes? Economics.
Economics, it drives, and it also will indicate, as we talk, next time we're gonna talk about the rise of the abolition movement and
Yep.
slavery in the United States specifically. You see this, the resistance in the South to changing the economic and social system, because over that last 100 to 150 years, because it's hard to go back much further than that, I mean, Georgia wasn't even a colony 150 years before the Civil War.
Right.
So we have some adjustment, but when you think about that, that's 5 generations
Mm-hmm.
of people that have come and gone.
Mm-hmm.
So that 5th generation is going to be expecting things, just like we talked about with the Caribbean. These whites who are no longer Frenchmen who go home to France. They're Frenchmen who live in Haiti.
Right.
It's a different mindset, and we see that in the South. That's a way of life, a peculiar institution
Oh.
that we'll talk about next time, how the forces of economics, again, bring new life to slavery, and also that tension that we talked about, and bring about opposition. So that's what we've got for today. You got anything else?
Oh no, I think we've come to a good stopping point, and thank you for joining us. Hopefully you will tune in, and if you missed the first episode, be sure to go onto YouTube under AJ Historical Productions. Hit that like button, hit that share button, so that we can,
Do we have a
spread the
subscribe
word.
button yet?
Yes, we do. So make
So,
sure you subscribe to our
Then
channel.
That means you'll get an email and a notification every time we release a new one, which like now, when we're not in school, will probably
Right.
be more frequent than once
Mhm.
school starts and we start grading papers and
And doing all sorts of
tearing out
crazy
our hair.
things. Yes, I'm already starting to dread that.
so, yeah, it's August, that's when we know it happening. So, look forward to seeing you again next time, and we'll continue this discussion.
All right.